going to do is start with the book of Joshua. And we've been highly anticipating this study for a number of years. And if you would like to turn over to the book of Joshua, and if you're studying with us by watching the video later, we're going to be pulling the text out of Rashi's commentary, the Chumash. So you can go to Joshua, the first chapter. This class, for all intents and purposes, we're going to deal with the introduction, because we can't really talk about the book of Joshua until we discussed who Joshua was. Now, I know that you guys, and I welcome you guys to jump in and provide any historical context or background that I may have missed, but these are the simple notes that I've pulled together so that we can cobble together an introduction. It's really important to know who Joshua is if we're going to understand this great book. There is a huge contrast between the leadership of Moshe and Joshua. And we're going to see that both of them are just as important. Moshe, though a much greater leader, and he is referred to like the sun, and Joshua like the moon, there are two necessities for those. There is a necessity for the moon, there's a necessity for the sun. And so we're going to draw those contrasts in a little bit. Joshua, as you'll remember, Joshua ben Nun from the tribe of Ephraim was the second person to lead the Jewish people in their early history. He was the one and only leader that never appointed a successor to himself. He never had a successor. Joshua spent the early part of his life under the tutelage of Moshe and took over him when the Israelites entered the land. And it's an interesting concept that Moshe led Israel while they were in the height of their spiritual journey and their maturation and maturity process. And then Joshua picks up, and not only is he a great teacher and a great leader, but a great warrior. And it seems that Joshua had to be very grounded in the physical world so that he could lead them through the very difficult times that it would take to live in the land and to conquer the land. And we'll cover that in a little bit more detail. Joshua's charisma and skill as a leader eventually led him to have a fantastic success with the nation of Israel and a tremendous amount of love. After Moshe died, and not until Samuel's reign 100 years later do the Israelites find a comparable leader. So think about it. You know, we complain in our modern politics because the last time we went to the voting booth, the person didn't get in office we never even conceive it's going to take another 100 years before we get a decent president in office. God forbid. But at the same time, 100 years is a long time to go without a without a proper leader. There is for some reason my video is not showing properly. Am I on the primary of the video, or is it Mary? Am I showing on your video? No, I am, or who's?
Your primary.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know why that happened that way. Okay, so we go back. The first appearance of Joshua, as we've heard from Ross, Joshua is in Exodus, the 17th chapter. He's called Hosea. And when the Israelites were attacked by the Amalekites after crossing the Red Sea, it is Hosea that leads the counterattack. He defeats the enemy and subsequently becomes Moshe's right-hand man and assistant, who actually his leadership really set him apart from anybody else. And he then became Moshe's protege. He is next mentioned at Mount Sinai, and he waits diligently at the edge of the mountain for Moshe to descend. Thus, unlike the other members of his tribe, Hosea is not involved in the sin of the golden calf. Instead, he was waiting, anticipating Moshe to come down. Hosea's most notable exploit in the Torah takes place during the episode of the spies in Numbers, the 13th and 14th chapter. We all know what happened with that. He and Joshua and Caleb go into the land as the consummate optimist, and they come back with a group of pessimists. And the pessimists seem to win. And no matter of convincing the Israelites to side with them, they ended up not being able to go into the land because of the pessimistic people and what ended up happening there. It is also during the episode of the spies that Joshua, his name is changed. Hosea's name is changed to Joshua. And according to Midrashic sources, Moses foresaw the disaster that would occur when the spies returned and gave his apprentice moral support by adding the name of God to his name, changing his name from saves, Hosea, to Joshua or Yehoshua, God saves. Now, this is also going to be an important part of his leadership style in the future, because Hosea or Joshua, meaning God saves, over and over in battle, God becomes the one who redeems Israel in the time of battle. As Moses' death draws near, Joshua is chosen to be a successor, and the Pentateuch ends with the Israelites on the verge of crossing the Jordan in the land of Canaan. And the first book of the prophets, which is Joshua, picks up where the Torah leaves off. And this is why we've never really had a chance to go into the book of Joshua, because we've just ended there with the portion and circled right back around. And actually, this is a really good time. By the time we finish our study in Joshua, it will be time to go back into another round of the Torah portion. Immediately, Joshua demonstrates a duality within his character that was missing from that of Moses. Now, let me explain. While Moses was primarily a spiritual leader who acted as a religious intermediary between God and the Jews, Joshua was capable of doing things within combat and leadership that Moshe was not able to do. He was not only a spiritual leader, but a military commander, as well as it shows his relationship from that of Moses. Indeed, his new role reflects the new reality that the Israelites encountered in their new homeland. In the desert, they needed a spiritual leader that would guide them, that would walk them every step of the way, that would help them to face their spiritual challenges, that would teach them all through the 40 years. Joshua, on the other hand, like being the moon, and this is really an interesting play on Midrashic text that says that Moshe is like the sun and Joshua is like the moon that reflects the light of the sun. Remember that going in to what I call material physicality, which is the land of Israel, because we all remember that the 10 spies were petrified that they would be consumed by the land of Israel. It was no longer going to be sugar, cookies, and milk. It was like they're going to have to get out there and work for what they had. And it was a daunting task. And yet Joshua is chosen to take them into that place that is fearful, that is daunting because you have enemies. And in many aspects, compared to the what do you call it, the living at home with mom and pop in the desert, Moshe, to living in the land, almost is like nighttime, is almost like darkness. You understand? And Joshua reflected that whole time of his service, he reflected Moshe back into physicality, which is an amazing kind of concept that understands that Joshua's job, though different and is not as elevated as Moshe, was nevertheless still as important as Moshe's. Over the course of the book of Joshua, it emphasizes the role that God plays in the leader's victories. The account of one battle, for example, Joshua 10, for example, the Torah reports that as evening approaches, the Jews wanted to win the battle. And so they cried out to Hashem, and what did he do? Caused the sun to stop so that they could win the battle. I mean, we're going to see over and over. Now it's not only Hosea or it is in saved, but God saves. This whole idea that Joshua exudes this whole confidence in the creator of the universe to say, if he has to stop time and space to save us, he will do it. That's an incredible thing. The Battle of Jericho, for example, the Israelites at first is won by surrounding the walls of the city and walking around them, causing them to miraculously collapse. It wasn't because of giant missiles and catapults that they won. They won by simply doing what God required them to do. According to the Midrash, Joshua eventually married a woman by the name of who? Rahab. Very good. I didn't hear you, but I saw your lips. Rahab, and the prophet Jeremiah and Yulda were their descendants. However, there is no actual report in the book of Joshua of the leader marrying anyone having any family life whatsoever. So here are the difference between the Midrashic or oral tradition and what is the written tradition. From Jericho, the nation proceeds to Ai, Alpha, Yud, and then the rest of Canaan. According to Midrash, however, the forcible conquest, the bloody battles reported in the rest of the book are only part of the story. When approaching a city, it said that Joshua would send out emissaries, probably some of his commanders, and they would give the city an opportunity to accept the Sheva Mitzvot, to leave their idolatry, to reject their beliefs and other gods, and they would be able to peacefully live within the land. And the one record that we see is the Gibeonites were allowed to live peacefully with them. And at one point, and Joshua, he makes a pact to defend them. And then also, he makes not only this policy of peace, but he later defended them against attackers that were coming from the outside. So it's an incredible story of a covenant relationship between the people of Israel and the righteous or the pious of the nations that reject idolatry. And Baruch Hashem, we're living in an age where we're seeing Joshua 9 and 10 take place again in our modern era. For whatever reason, Joshua, unlike Moses, did not appoint a successor in his death, as his death approaches. As a result of the leadership vacuum, the Israelites began to sin not long after Joshua's death. And rather than completing the conquest, they just got fat and happy and comfortable. Isn't that exactly what Hashem said you were going to do? You're going to get in the land, and you're going to be sated, you're going to be satisfied, and then you're going to forget that I was the one that brought you out of Egypt and brought you into this land. I want to go now and look into some of the characteristics of Joshua that I think are important. Before we go to that, does anybody have any comment about this before we move on, or input? So far, none? Okay, we're going to go on. So the Bible describes Joshua as a devoted student. It says that he studied, or he was in the tents of Moshe, which means he's a student. A tzaddik, saintly man, a brilliant military commander. As I said before, Joshua led his people on all fronts, exhorting them to serve God, to uphold the Torah, while at the same time leading them into conquest. He was born in Egypt in 2406, which would be 1355 BCE. He led his people 28 years until he passed in the year of 2516, which would be 1245 BCE. This begins the story of Joshua. First of all, let's talk about a faithful disciple. What made Joshua so unique compared to all of the heads of the tribes. Joshua, son of Nun, was from the tribe of Ephraim. His name was originally, as we said, Hosea, but Moshe later changed it. He was Moses' faithful attendant, about whom the Bible attests that he never moved from the tent. What does that mean? Never moved from the tent. But what this means literally wasn't that he never left the tent to go do anything, because clearly he did when he carried on the exploits of his job. But it said that he didn't move from the tent because he didn't move from Torah. He stuck exactly what Moshe said, and he was devoted to his master, which is his teacher. He waited on him hand and foot. He waited on him at Mount Sinai. While Moses was atop communicating with God, he formed an important link in the chain of transition. Since Moses taught Joshua the Torah, he passed on those teachings to the elders, who relayed the teachings to those after them. And when Moses would go to the tent of meeting to communicate with God, Joshua would accompany him. First standing up in defense of his master's honor. You remember this? Joshua was infuriated when Eldad and Medad prophesied about Moshe's death. Remember this. We can go back and read that story if we wanted to. Let's look at another characteristic. Number one, he was a faithful disciple. Second, he was a righteous spy. Why was he a righteous spy? Because he had complete trust in God. He had emunah. Joshua's most notable exploit of the 5 books of Moses took place during the episode of the spies in Numbers, the 13th and 14th chapter. He was chosen to represent the tribe of Ephraim among the group of 12 leaders who traveled to Canaan to scout out the land. Upon return from their mission, the 10 spies frightened the people with tales of giants, and land consumed its inhabitants. It was declared unconquerable. Cannot do it. Only Joshua and Caleb were dissented from that opinion, and attempted in no avail to convince the Jewish people that God had their back and was going to take care of them. It was right before the departure of the spies that Moses feared that the spies would fail their mission, and he added that letter in Joshua's name, meaning God, may God save you. Basically, Joshua was being told that this is going to be a particular strong challenge to your future. Let's talk about Moses' successor. Now, I can't imagine, guys, being in the camp and think of who would be the best successor for Moshe. What a challenge. And think about what a challenge for him to step in the shoes of Moshe. And he must have been able to prove himself to the highest level for the people to just accept Joshua. It just, to me, it speaks of the volume of character that he had, and also the fact that he was a very righteous man, and he was a righteous spy. He was honest and full of integrity. Now, it says that on the 7th of Nisan, 1488, once the 30-day mourning period of Moses concluded, Joshua received God's command to prepare the children of Israel to cross Jordan. 3 days later, Joshua led the people through a miraculously split river. Once again, Joshua's mission was clear. He was to enter the land, conquer its inhabitants, divide the land into portions for all the tribes. God promised him success on his conquest. No man shall stand, according to the text, no man shall stand up before you all these days of your life. As I was with Moses, so shall I be with you, and I will not weaken my grasp on you, nor will I abandon you. Be strong and have courage, for you will cause this nation to inherit that land, and that I have sworn to their ancestors to give them. God also cautioned him to remain steadfast, commitment into the Torah and mitzvahs, also encouraging the people too. Let's examine Joshua's wife, go a little bit more detail. Immediately after crossing the Jordan, Joshua sent 2 spies, Caleb and Pinchas, to the city of Jericho. The Jews first point of attack, disguised as spies, made their way into the end of the owner by the name of Rahab. When the spies were discovered, the soldiers were dispatched to capture them, and Rahab saved their lives. She asked them that just as she had saved their life, if they would also be so kind as to spare her life, in which she did. She told them that she had heard, and everyone in town had heard of the exploits of the Israelites coming from Egypt, and by all means, she was convinced that their God was the ultimate God. The spies gave Rahab a word and gave her an opportunity to sneak out. And later, after the Jews kept their word and saved Rahab and her family, she converted to Judaism. She was a very special woman. Our sages teaches that God seeks out righteous people from the nations and draws them into his faith, citing Rahab and Jethro as examples. Now, of course, we all know as lovers of Torah, as being righteous and pious people of the nations, Jethro and Rahab are like folk heroes, right? We're the ones that say, look, this is how God can use them. He can also use us. Not that I think that God's going to call me to be, Joshua's second man, hand man, or wife, but I can tell you right now, the pious of the nation should understand they have an important role in the fulfillment of helping the Jewish people return back to the land. I was just talking to Rabbi Weissman today, and we were talking about how important it is that the pious of the nations will be the ones going, why haven't you guys built your temple yet? What's up with that? You guys need to build a temple. It's going to be the people of the nations insisting that they build the temple. And so far, it seems pretty dark, but I can tell you right now, we're going to see the wind shift very soon, God willing. She's a very special, prominent woman. Our sages teach that God seeks out righteous people, as I said, so sincere and holy was she. Joshua even married her. 8 prophets, including Jeremiah, descended from their union. I said this before, I'll just mention it quickly. He was a second character, a third characteristic it's important to know him by is a capable military commander. For 7 years, Joshua led the people in battle, vanquished 31 kings, conquered their lands. And for 7 years after that, Joshua oversaw the division of land amongst the 12 tribes, allocating a portion to each family. One facet of Joshua's persona was a devoted Torah student, and another of his military acumen and pragmatic leadership skills. In fact, the very first time Joshua is mentioned in the Bible is when, shortly after the Jewish people redeemed from the land of Egypt were traveling the desert, they were attacked by the Amalekites. Moses ordered Joshua to gather the fighters and command the battle. While Moses prayed for their welfare, Joshua and his soldiers fought and defeated the Amalekites. We mentioned that Joshua first testimony of complete emunah and Hashem was the walls of Jericho, in which he appealed to Hashem, how are we going to tear down, how these walls are going to be torn down, and he did exactly what he was supposed to do. Now, last but not least, actually, I got 2 more things. Number one, let's talk about a leadership farewell about Joshua. So we're going to go all the way back to the end here, his passing. Like his predecessor had done 2 years before his passing, Joshua gathered the nation in Shechem, and the future was uncertain. The land was not entirely settled. There were pockets of enemies remaining scattered throughout the land. There was a possibility of assimilation with the Canaanite tribes and the acquisition of their perverted practices. Joshua warned the people to guard against assimilation with idolatrous natives. He urged them to apply themselves to the study of Torah and to keeping his precepts. Only by Israel's devoted loyalty to Torah would they be assured a healthy national existence. The nation swore their allegiance to Hashem and his Torah. 2 years later, at the age of 110, Joshua passed away. He's buried and was deeply mourned by the people. The Torah testified the Jewish people remained loyal to God, studied the Torah, and obeyed his commandment for all the days of Joshua's life. out of sight, out of mind. In addition to his role as a leadership and warrior, Joshua is the second link in the chain of Torah transmission of Torah. Remember Rabbi Wobies talking about the transmission of Torah from Sinai to Moshe, from Moshe to Joshua, then Joshua to the leadership, to the rest of the elders. Now let's talk about the special leadership. I just touched on it a little while ago, but whereas Moses was the leader of the Jewish people when they were in the desert, Joshua was a first world leader of the people of Israel. In the desert, Jews were able to serve God easily since there was no worldly concerns. Their shoes didn't wear out. Their clothing didn't wear out. Their clothes grew on them if there were children. God's glorious cloud sheltered them. Manna fell from heaven to sustain them and miraculously well provided them water in the desert. They had no care. When they entered into the land, things became more difficult spiritually and physically. Now, you would think that through 40 years of turmoil and growth and development and purging and cleansing, that you would get into the land and it would be smooth sailing. Well, unfortunately, this is not a truism. As well, what we truly find out that when an individual goes into the land or goes and reaches a place of perfection, though you may not have the same struggles, you will have struggles, and they will be struggles that will be much more difficult than what it was when you were in the what I call the spiritual incubation period. It is once you reach a level of maturity that you really have to fight it out for yourself. And I've used this analogy over and over and over about a young man or a young woman living in a household, and all of a sudden they're out of the house, going to college, learning how to struggle on their own. And look, if they're not fortunate to have parents to pay for their college, they have to figure out how to juggle that monumental task of having money and going to college and working full-time jobs. That's when it becomes more difficult. But the true test of a person is when they transition into living in the world of physicality and spirituality. How do you continue to weather? Not whether you can serve him when you have no need. Does that make sense, guys? Because serving him when you have all of your bread and all your clothes and all your shoes, everything provided, nothing too difficult to handle, clouds by day, fire by night, that's easy to serve Hashem then. But you would think getting in the land, having your own house, having your land, you're not a slave anymore. But now you have to till the soil. You have to remove the stones. You have to allow the land to rest. You have to follow the Torah. Oh my goodness, what a different contrast. Joshua stood up to the task of leading the people of Israel. He weathered the odds on the battlefield and in the study hall, conquering and settling, all while inspiring his people to stay faithful to God. The Talmud declares Moshe and Joshua, as I said, to the sun and moon. Respectfully, Moses, like the sun, the source of light, because delivered the Jewish people the Torah and brought light of godliness into the world. He represents a top-to-bottom approach to serving God. Now, notice the difference with Joshua. Joshua, on the other hand, is compared to the moon, which has no light of its own, merely reflects the sun. This represents the bottom-up approach to godly service. The first was God coming to man to bring him his precepts and to bring him order. The second is the ultimate place that we all are living, and that is, how do we bring godliness from where we're at and return it back to Hashem? So Joshua reflects this whole idea that this represents that what I call bottom-up approach to godly service, the idea of transforming and elevating the necessities of life, the difficulties of life into a higher level. Joshua's mode was the unique advantage in which he achieved that the world uh, itself would become godly, not just that had godliness imposed into it, but that they, in providing or living godliness and living the Torah, would help to cause physicality to blossom and to become a place and a dwelling place of Hashem. That concludes the introduction to the book of Joshua. And next Wednesday, we're going to start getting into text and some other extra sources on the book of Joshua.